But if you want to know about technical systems, I'm here, I'm there, I'm in it, I'm doing it. We can enact our sense-making of being in a socio-technical system as an enactment, yes. However, it's when we do thinking, both long-term thinking and participative thinking, such as in the circle of theorists that I've introduced. And that's when we can explore kind of the longer history of thinking and the future of thinking about a socio-technical system. It's one thing to, be sense-making about it, observing it. And we will try to make another contribution for you today, which is that each of us experiences these socio-technical systems in radically different ways. Even if I'm in the same radiation room as the technicians that are sending electrons into my body, I don't experience that event in the same way as a patient as they do as technicians, nor does my wife experience it in the same way, Grace-Ann Rosille here. She does not experience it in the same way in the waiting room. So while we're in the same socio-technical system and we're co-located in the same space-time, we are not experiencing this in the same way. And it's not about being subjective, okay? Let's just toss that out the window right away.
I'm going to talk about time and how we create the story of time, and how what we want to look at is not just the story, the text itself, but the context, how we make meaning from the time spent with Adobe, actual use versus updating. Using your home gym, how many times in the week? In the week after you bought it, and a month after that is a little different. The probability that the customer service representative will answer my call, probability almost immediately, is pretty low. But as we go on, after 5 minutes, immediately after I hang up is the time, the magic time. And finally, we look at time as it relates to our own careers, from birth to death. This chart shows the trajectory of your intended career path and the difference with your actual career path over time. Those examples show you that we can reify time and depict it in a chart and a graph, and we can treat it different ways. But what makes it different is the context. It's the story and what came before that story that created, that what's underlying that story that creates the meaning for us. There's a classic story told in philosophy of science about an apartment building where the elevators, the tenants were complaining that the elevators were too slow. Well, to get faster elevators was very expensive. But then someone suggested a cheap solution, and of course management went for the cheap solution. They put mirrors on each side of the elevators on every floor. There were no further complaints about the slow elevators. So what does that tell us about time? When we are, people are somewhat like canaries. We can't resist a mirror or primping our hair or something. So time is perceived differently, and it's treated differently and measured differently. Disney knows this as they entertain people when they wait in long lines. The slow food movement has turned around how we look at time and the value of time by saying that what's valuable about eating is not how fast you can get your food and how fast you can eat, but rather the slow process of community, sharing food together. So keep in mind that when you want to look at time, we don't just look at the story, we want to look at the anti-narrative, the story that came before, that led to this, that underlies this, the hidden stories. That's what we mean by anti-narrative, and that's how time can be treated differently in our research.
When we think about time and narrative and storytelling, we need to start breaking these things down more precisely, because the word time covers many, many facets of experience. Our primary experiences are, so the facets that we think about with time are lies that we tell ourselves about ideal types that never really exist. In the same way, when Newton encountered movement, there was the movement of the growing of flowers, and there was the movement of atoms, and there was a movement of people, and it was all just called movement. And you had to drill down and actually ask about each one of these things to understand how we're tricking ourselves. So we have all these dichotomies by which we make things timely. We try to objectify them. Biofication, right? We have this socially created time. And then we have, on the other end, embodied experiences. Reification. In time, things that we call timely, things out of time. Things that we say are not part of a temporal consideration. Think short-term versus long-term gains. Time references, right? How close to our time or far away is it? Directionality, is it going towards the future or the past? The depth of our temporal references, are we going shallow or deep? Are we wading into something or jumping in? What's our experience in engaging that time? How much change is occurring? Is this about entropy or growth? Or stasis, something in between where we recognize constant change and try and cover it up? Are the effects of time something that's an observer effect? Is it happening because we're attending to it? Or is it happening because we're participating with it? And all of these work in a fractal, because ironically, the objectified time that we all share, 60 seconds in a minute, that is socially constructed. And what we call subjective time, that need to eat, that need to sleep, those sorts of things are actually physically embodied. That's not a socially constructed. And so we have these fractal patterns of social to objective to social, from objective to social to objective. And really, we're engaging in a basic kind of question. How much of time is out of reason, and how much of it is out of that underlying morass of intense, unrational possibility that leads to the potential for the emergence of reason?
So to build on Ronnie's point, we can understand time differently. So think about, clock time, for example. There's a difference between 2 and 4 p.m. versus 5 and 7 a.m. versus 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. And that's for one person. Although we also talk about morning people, afternoon people, nighttime people, and they would experience those same blocks of time differently. So if we leave the clock time behind, but we think maybe about time in terms of some sort of like a progression, but that's not always the same either. I love weightlifting, and I always think about this. When I'm doing the first and the second reps of a set, that's very different than reps number 10 and 11 in a set. And the first and second reps in one set is very different than the first and second reps in the second set, as would be the 10th and 11th rep. So I'm experiencing these kinds of repetitions differently. So the distance between any two integers, whether you're looking at a process kind of time or a clock-based time, isn't really the same. But we want to get away from this understanding of this subjective-objective dichotomy, but instead we're looking at an objectification of time. So what we have tried to do is objectify time in some sort of a technical sense. And our job is to bridge this gap between these false objectifications with the living story of experiencing time. And this is where David will come in and discuss a little bit more on co-creating digital healthcare.
I'm sitting here in the patient room with other patients, and we are all experiencing time quite differently as we wait for radiation. There's a women's room off to my left. There's a men's dressing and changing room off to my right. they have radiation machines over there for the women's issues, radiation machines for the men's issues. We're all waiting our turn. Most of the men have their legs crossed because we have to have a certain volume of water that we hold in our bladder before they can initiate the radiation treatment. Last week was my first radiation treatment. So my target was too high. I couldn't meet it. I was unable to hold the water, and I kept having to do it again and again. So I wasn't able to enter that socio-technical system with any level of comfort. And sometimes I peed where I wasn't supposed to because I couldn't just hold it anymore. And this week I've been doing better. So this will be number 10 today, I think, of radiation out of 28 radiation events. And what I want to communicate to you about socio-technical systems is each one of those events is entirely different. Like one day I was all set, I had the right volume in my bladder, and then the machine didn't work. I had to restart. And two other times I had too much water. And this nurse actually handed me a cup and said, well, why don't you just pee off a quarter of a cup here? And I go, I don't think I can do that as a man. I don't think I could just pee a quarter of a cup. I think, and I tried to hold it, but I could pee 2 cups, but not a quarter of a cup. And I had to start over, and it takes time to get going again to where the body moves that. And we're talking about something very ontological in the once occurrent eventness of being. If you follow that kind of philosophy, and Bakhtin or Heidegger's being in time, I'm in this freedom zone, but I'm also in it because I chose to be here. But I'm in a socio-technical system that has me laid out on the table, my feet in the stirrups, bombarding me. I asked the medical or the radiation oncologist to explain to me how this machine works. And it bombards electrons into my prostate, and this causes photons to exit cancer cells. It's targeted with little gold chips that have been embedded in my prostate through surgery. And that's how they do very, very accurate targeting. But I've been doing kind of informal interviews with some people about their grandparents and things. And they only had surgery as an option, or they would chop off their jewels as an option to lower testosterone. Right now, my testosterone is lower than a 50-year-old woman. In other words, it's very low, below the threshold for a man. Now, the good news, I'm going to live. I'm going to be very, very healthy. And hopefully in another year, I can actually visit you at the conference and be jogging around with the rest of you. But this year, I thought they'd schedule my radiation differently than the Keynote, but they schedule it when they want to schedule it. They don't schedule it at the convenience of Iceland, you know? So I apologize for all of those things. And I just want to give you a sense of, I'm also in a great deal of pain right now. And when we were preparing last night, my wife and I helps me prepare, I said, look, we got to call in Ronnie, Duncan, and Jillian because I don't think I can do this for more than 5 minutes at a time. And that's, you know, it's just tears come to my eyes because I don't like to let down anybody in my performance. I like my performance to be number one. And I have to just accept the fact that at this stage of radiation treatments, I'm not able to do it. I'm on androgen deprivation therapy, which means they do, well, things that you don't want to know about.
I'm going to try to bring together all of these parts and explain why each of these things are very valuable to the research that is currently being done. One of the important things about the social technical philosophy is it's really about that context But the context is an incomplete story without knowing all the interactions and the flow of time, because a system is a process that is seen as moving, which is also an element of time. There is the basis of technology could be going on the technology time or going on the human time, or having that story of when is it the machine is leading, when is it the human leading, what's creating it, how do we approach it. And so we talk about sometimes technology is disruptive to what humans are trying to do, and or humans not utilizing the technology to the best of its potential. And so by having and using storytelling gives us a greater depth to our data and ability to show, as it's moving through a system, the interrelationships of the material and the human together.
And so we can see this. We can see this as we experience time. It takes time to digest things. We say time flies, time is running out. The attention and care and love and concern that we have changes our experience of time, so that we say time flies or time is running out. Ultimately, these are all abstractions for subjective individual experiences, and time cannot be severed at the joints. All of those dichotomies that we talked about are multiple dimensions interacting with each other all at once. We really need to understand temporality in a digital world, not as something that can be fully technicalized, but as something that needs to be crafted for the individual and their experiences. And that means that we need to understand that sometimes we enter a digital world, like David here has been playing Pokemon Go, and time just disappears, right? And other times we're updating Pokemon Go, and time takes forever, right? But if you could throw a Pokeball at Pikachu, I'm pretty sure that download would go a lot faster phenomenologically, right? So with that, we would say there's fantastic work. We've read all the papers. David, Grayson, Duncan, Jillian, and myself, we spent all yesterday reading through the papers and talking about this philosophy and how it links together with the work that you're doing. And for example, there's this question of flow and barriers to flow, things that are too easy or things that are too hard, and how we can get into that center space. Well, as we look through all of these definitions of time, that allows us to engage the question of flow for the individual. Similarly, the way the environment is appraised as being taxing or exceeding someone's resources or harming someone's well-being, it's a function of their experience of the time that they're investing in it. And additionally, we see that technological change is not just the change of technology, it's the change of people as they engage that technology. So it's constant organizational change, whether it's maintaining processes that are ongoing or trying to change them. Even that maintenance is a constant process of change to adapt so it seems the same over time. And in that way, we see that socio-technic systems in information systems are like socio-technic systems in storytelling. It's inside of a temporality that covers many meanings. And by digging those out, we can start to appreciate the different ways people interact across.
I would add one more point to what was said, that when we look back at the elevator example, it reminds us that which anti-narrative are we embedded in? And is that anti-narrative privileging the technical or the social? And do we have a balance? And have we adequately considered both sides of those potential anti-narratives? And that is where we start change, by looking at all those assumptions and those anti-narratives in which we're embedded to change the whole system.
If you want more background on anti-narrative, go to antinarrative.com, ANTE narrative.com, and you see about 35 papers that have been published in various journals and books. And you can get up to speed. You can go to enthinkment.com, ENTHINKMENT.com, and join us any Tuesday, depending on where you are in the world. And we've got a lot of information there about, and a free book you can download on my latest work on being mentored by one of the greatest systems people of all time, Louis Ralph Pondy. And at this point, we would love to hear from you.
Very interesting, I'm curious about, the philosopher Immanuel Kant, he coined something called the a priori categories. And by that he meant, sort of innate or categories by which we confer a meaning, on fabric of meaning onto brute reality. And these categories are sort of brought by the evolution of mankind or humankind. So have you thought about time and space in those terms as innate categories brought about by the evolution?
So the way I go at that, and I read your paper, I love it, is Mikhail Bakhtin, one of the great narrative theorists of all times, taught Kantian philosophy in Russia. And he wanted to amend some things in Kant. And what we've been talking about comes under the technical term, as you know, of the architectronic, which is in the Critique of Pure Reason, right in the very last section of that book. And the architectronic was Immanuel Kant's definition of a system. But Immanuel Kant only defined it a system as a cognition, but those cognitions of what a system is were coupled with his definitions of time and space, which were descended from a universalist understanding coming down from heaven, if you will. What Bakhtin wanted to do was develop an ontology of time in relation to the architectronics. So he said, I'm going to redefine the dialogism of the architectonic. And this is something that only the socio-technical people could understand, because narrative people only study polyphony. They only study stylistics, and a little bit of chronotope. I've got some articles on that with Ronnie. But they never study the architectronic, which is the whole system of all of the systems together, and how are we participating in that. So he wanted to include Kant, as you're saying, but he also wanted to bring in, besides the cognitive, he wanted to bring in the aesthetic and the ethical, so that the three discourses would be interanimating. By discourses, he just meant the way people talk and write about stuff, the way that they tell stories about stuff. It can be a cognitive, it can be an ethical, it can be the aesthetic. But he said, we want to get to the way of doing things, that there's a big difference between a socio-technical system. He didn't use that language, neither Kant nor Bakhtin, but in our parlance, we say socio-technical system. But there's a big difference between theorizing about it and actually being here. That's why today I wanted to film from the MD Anderson Cancer Clinic, rated in U.S. News, World and Newsweek report as #1 cancer clinic in the nation. I don't know. Probably there's others in the world that are better, but it's what I have access to. So I'm in the once occurrent eventness of being. I have to be here. If I lose my place in line, I lose a radiation treatment. I need that radiation treatment to live. That's my participation in the once occurrent eventness of being in a very ontological sense. So Kant was not an ontologist. He was, dare I say, more of an ethicist with a bent toward the cognitive.
Someone asked the question of what makes something timely.
The way that I've kind of characterized time, I've built on something kind of new, but we all talk about chronological time, right? You know, it's 10 minutes have passed, an hour has passed, you know, which interestingly enough, at the cosmic and the microscopic level, this chronological time doesn't exist. So we've objectified time chronologically, and yet it's a human construction. You know, let that sink in for a minute, right? And we also have the other kind of time, the chirological time, which you probably are quite familiar with. That's more of it's normally seen as a qualitative time. Some people might say it's the study of opportune moments, right? Recognizing that the time is now or never. But you can also look at it in terms of measuring time through a process, like a series of steps in a process. And one good way that I say you can recognize the separation between chronological and chirological. This student, I'm not sure if it was he or she, but the student wrote in there, if I only had 5 minutes left to live, I would spend it in your class because it would seem like an eternity.
When I met Grace Ann at a conference, an academic conference, we were standing in the cafeteria line. She was in the cafeteria line. I was on the other side of the room. I saw, wow, what a beautiful woman. And I ran across the room, got in line behind her, and I heard her say to the lady in front of her, I'm only going to date vegetarians from now on. My ex-husband and I had to make meat dishes. I don't want to do that anymore. So I raised my hand and said, I'm a vegetarian. I heard you say vegetarian. What's good here? Now, that was the instant, timely conversion of me from meat eater to vegetarian right there. Now, is that a lie in the Kantian perspective? Never eat meat again. Is it a lie, I think, you know? So that's the timing of something where you have that window of opportunity. You're deeply in love. You go for it. It either happens then or it doesn't happen at all, you know? Grace Ann tells it completely differently, but, you know, that's the way I experience time.
And this is the core of ontonarrative. Many people are not familiar with this concept, but if you study philosophy, the philosophers always get at this, and the readers of philosophy always gloss it over because it's hard, but once you have this intuition, you see it. The future comes before the past, not for billiard balls, but for people. Because the meaning we make out of our memories, those little moments of the past that we draw on to develop a narrative in a moment, those come from those little bets on the future that we're holding on to. And so for a meaningful individual, the future comes first, those little bets on the future, and they clear the way for the upwelling of the present out of those past moments.
We have a question in the chat that says, what do you think about the relevance of rhythm for collaboration within social-technical systems?
Well, it's absolutely essential. You know, Aristotle wrote about it in his book and the Poetics, and it's something that the narratology is focused on plots and character, but not on the rhythm. Rhythm is a process, you know, and socio-technical systems have rhythms to them. And I have to get into the rhythm of the radiation events here and carry that out, the rhythm of the different medications, the interactions of those medications, the time I can see a doctor, not see a doctor. The socio-technical system is so overwhelming to me, even as a theorist, because the medical oncologist and the surgical oncologist and the integrative oncologist have very different departments on different floors and different staff, and nobody schedules somebody else's department. You have to go in that department, go up and down the ladders, getting an appointment, getting through to it. It's like a very complex adaptive system. And yet somehow it works, and it's one of the best in the world. I would prefer it was less bureaucratic. I have all kinds of notebooks on how I think they could improve their socio-technical system. I don't think they're ready to listen to me yet. But, you know, it's interesting being on the inside of it as a patient versus being on the outside as a theorist or change agent or something, and just having to feel that feeling of being out of control, the feeling of you're in a digital world of not just Pokemon, but like I'm staring at an appointment board that has the time I checked in, the time other people have checked in, how much delay there is for the next machine, etc. But there's also a chart called My Chart where they have all my test results, like over 100 tests. They have all the appointments I've ever had, and the ones that are coming up in the next 2 months. I'm very fortunate to be in a clinical trial. Talk about timely. We almost missed getting in a clinical trial by seconds. And if we hadn't gotten the clinical trial, I wouldn't be here doing this, I'd be in New Mexico where they'd be saying, you got 3 years to live, David. You have 3 years to live. You maybe want to, check out your life better and get your stuff in order. You know what I mean? But with these guys, I'll probably live a long time. I encourage all of you to check in for radiation to learn about socio-technical systems. Now, just, if you want to learn about hospitals, be a patient in a hospital, we encourage doctors and nurses to sleep in their own hospital beds so they get a sense of what that's like. I'm ready for my doctor to be sitting on that radiation table.
The timing has been perfect, and the talk has been truly interesting. I think we should give David Boye and his whole team a big hand.